Welcome to the Missing Docs channel. While wandering into streets of Medina, thought about the childhood of Prophet Muhammad's grandson, Imam Hussein, felt like I am able to visualize that era.
It's a really remarkable thought exercise, framing it exactly that way, because when you walk those ancient, quiet streets, it is so easy to picture the origins of the Islamic community, right? The early.
Yeah, the foundational moments.
Exactly, the foundational moments of the faith. But today, we're taking a journey from those tranquil streets of Medina to the blistering, blood-stained sands of Karbala.
Right, in the year 680 CE.
Yeah, 680 CE. And we're doing it by opening up this massive, incredibly detailed scholarly dossier. We're exploring 100 of the most taboo, contested, and absolutely critical questions surrounding Imam Hussein ibn Ali and the tragedy that unfolded at Karbala.
And honestly, these are the kinds of questions that make a lot of people, shift uncomfortably in their seats.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we're not just looking at the traditional elegies or the poetry that gets recited every year. The dossier we're looking at today includes critiques from ex-Muslims, from atheists, modern secular historians, right alongside the intense, often highly technical internal debates between classical Sunni and Shia scholars.
Yeah.
This isn't the sanitized, simplified version of history.
Far from it. The mission here is rigorous, unflinching analysis. You might have grown up hearing the traditional narrative, sure, but today we are subjecting those narratives to the strictest historical and theological lenses available.
Right.
We really want to unpack the genuinely tough questions that critics raise. Like, for instance, was Hussein's march an epic political miscalculation?
Yeah, reckless suicide mission.
Exactly. Was it a suicide mission that doomed his family? And perhaps most importantly, for modern historians, how much of what we think we know is verifiable, documented fact versus, later theological evolution or cultural myth-making?
The thing is, whether you're a devout Muslim, a secular historian, or just someone who tuned in because you're insanely curious about world history, understanding how this single isolated event shaped the political and moral framework for over 1 billion people. It's fascinating.
It really is.
It's actually pretty simple.
Yep.
You cannot possibly understand modern Middle Eastern geopolitics. You cannot understand modern Islamic theology. And you certainly can't understand the dynamics of civil resistance in that region without understanding the exact mechanics of Karbala. It's the hinge on which a massive door of world history swings.
That's the perfect way to contextualize it. And let's be absolutely clear up front. Our role in analyzing this dossier is not to take a sectarian side.
No, not at all.
We are not here to declare one theological camp the winner. We're here to act as your guides through the texts, laying out exactly what the primary sources, the classical scholars, and the modern experts actually say. We want to understand the why and the how.
Yeah, like how a political dispute in the 7th century becomes a cosmic event in the minds of millions.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And to do that, we have to peel back 1,400 years of memory, of politics, empire building, and profound devotion.
Okay, so let's unpack this from the very beginning, because the chronology is crucial here. To understand the tragedy, we first have to ask why Hussein left the relative safety of Medina in the first place.
Right.
If I'm reading the secular critiques in this dossier correctly, Orientalist scholars, people like the German historian Julius Wellhausen, they look at this event and call Hussein's revolt premature and ill-prepared.
Yes, that's a very famous critique.
And honestly, looking at the sheer math, you can see why someone would say that. Why would the prophet's grandson march against a massive, entrenched Umayyad empire with only 72 fighters?
It sounds absurd on paper.
Right. The dossier mentions that senior companions of the prophet, like Ibn Abbas, literally begged him not to leave Mecca, warning him that he was, walking into a trap. So the atheist or secular critique naturally asks, was this just a reckless grab for power that went horribly, tragically wrong?
And that is absolutely the most common secular critique. It views the event strictly through the lens of a failed military coup. But to answer it fairly, we have to completely rebuild the geopolitical and socioeconomic reality of the year 680 CE.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Well, Hussein didn't just wake up one morning, look at a handful of friends, and decide to overthrow a continent-spanning empire on a whim. The historical sources, and we are talking about highly regarded classical Sunni chronicles like the work of Al-Tabari, they document a very specific political catalyst. Hussein had received over 18,000 letters from the people of Kufa.
Wait, let's pause on that number. 18,000 letters?
18,000!
In a pre-digital, pre-postal service era, how does that even work mechanically? How do you verify 18,000 signatures when most of the population is likely illiterate? That's not a fringe movement. That's a massive, coordinated political mandate.
It is a staggering logistical feat, which tells you how deeply organized the opposition to the Umayyad regime was in Kufa at that time. Kufa wasn't just any city, it was a major garrison town in Iraq, established by Umar, the second caliph.
So it's full of military guys.
Exactly. Veteran soldiers, tribal leaders, complex political factions. These letters were not individual pieces of parchment, like modern mail. They were heavily sealed scrolls carrying the collective endorsements of tribal chieftains, representing thousands of men under their command.
Oh, I see. So one signature equals a whole tribe's backing.
Yes, they were sworn pledges of allegiance, what is known in Islamic terminology as bay'ah. The people of Kufa were essentially begging Hussein to come and assume leadership, explicitly citing the unprecedented corruption and tyranny of the new Umayyad ruler, Yazid.
So mechanically speaking, Hussein is sitting in Mecca holding what amounts to a verified, signed petition from the military and tribal elite of a major province asking him to be their legitimate ruler.
Precisely. And acting as a responsible, calculated leader, Hussein didn't just rush out into the desert based on paper promises. He sent his trusted cousin, Muslim ibn Aqil, as an undercover emissary to Kufa to verify the situation on the ground.
Like an intelligence gathering mission.
Exactly. And Muslim initially reported back extraordinary success. Tens of thousands of Kufans had openly sworn allegiance to Hussein through him. So when Hussein finally made the decision to leave Mecca, he was responding to a verified, highly favorable political reality. I mean, he fully believed he had a standing army waiting to receive him.
But here's the catch. How do you go from tens of thousands of sworn supporters to just 72 fighters standing alone in the scorching desert? I mean, what happened to the 18,000 signatures?
The reality on the ground in Kufa shifted overnight due to a brutal change in Umayyad leadership. Yazid realized he was losing Iraq, so he dispatched his most ruthless governor, Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, to take control of Kufa.
And I'm guessing he didn't use diplomacy.
Not at all. Ibn Ziyad did not win the Kufans over with better theological arguments or political debate. He instituted an absolute suffocating regime of state terror.
What does state terror actually look like in 7th century Iraq?
It looks like economic strangulation and public executions. Kufa operated on the Atta system, which is a state stipend paid to soldiers and their families. Ibn Ziyad threatened to cut off the Atta for anyone showing sympathy to Hussein, effectively starving entire families.
Wow.
He imposed strict curfews, he took tribal leaders hostage, and most crucially, he hunted down and publicly executed Hussein's emissary, Muslim ibn Aqil, throwing his body from the roof of the governor's palace to send a chilling message to the populace. The Kufan support network collapsed, not necessarily out of voluntary malicious betrayal, but through sheer paralyzing fear.
I never thought about the economic angle. So it's like a modern authoritarian regime threatening to freeze the bank accounts of anyone who attends a protest, while simultaneously disappearing the protest leaders.
That's a very accurate modern parallel.
By the time Hussein is halfway across the desert, the jaws of the trap have already snapped shut. But he has no reliable communication lines to know it.
Exactly. He is marching into a city that has already been broken.
But wait, this brings up another major point from the secular critiques in the dossier. If Hussein realized the odds were turning against him, and the sources say he did start getting news of Muslim ibn Aqil's death on the road, why not just compromise? Why not just sign a treaty with Yazid? I mean, his older brother, Imam Hassan, had signed a peace treaty with Yazid's father, Muawiyah, years earlier to avoid civil war. Why couldn't Hussein just swallow his pride and do the same thing?
That is a phenomenal question, and it is central to understanding Hussein's psychology. It highlights why Yazid was a fundamentally different existential threat to Islam compared to Muawiyah. When Imam Hassan signed his treaty with Muawiyah, one of the core non-negotiable clauses was that Muawiyah would not appoint a hereditary successor.
Right, because it's not supposed to be a monarchy.
Exactly. The Islamic Caliphate was not supposed to be a Byzantine or Sassanian-style monarchy. It was supposed to be based on consultation and merit. By appointing his son Yazid, Muawiyah flagrantly violated the most critical clause of that treaty.
So it's like a CEO signing a strict, legally binding term sheet, agreeing that the company will remain public, and then immediately handing the entire board of directors over to his unqualified son.
Yes.
It wasn't just a disagreement over leadership style, it was an illegal breach of contract.
That is a very apt analogy, but the problem went much deeper than a broken contract. It was about the character of the successor. Yazid was documented by classical historians, and I'm talking about highly conservative Sunni historians like al-Dahabi and Ibn Kathir, who are generally protective of the early Islamic State. They documented him as being openly dissolute.
Like publicly violating the rules.
Openly. He publicly flouted Islamic law. He drank wine openly in court. He played with monkeys and dogs instead of attending to state affairs. And he openly mocked the very foundations of the Prophet's revelation.
So it wasn't just a political disagreement over who gets to sit on the throne and collect taxes. It was a crisis of the entire moral architecture of the society.
Yes. If Hussein, who was the direct grandson of the Prophet, the living embodiment of the prophetic household, gave his formal oath of allegiance to Yazid, he wouldn't just be accepting a difficult political reality. He would be providing religious, theological validation to the complete corruption of Islamic leadership.
He'd be co-signing it.
He would be signing a blank check for tyranny. Hussein explicitly stated in his letters that his goal was Islah, meaning the fundamental reform of his grandfather's community. He said he was going to enjoin good and forbid evil. If he merely wanted a comfortable kingdom, he easily could have taken a massive bribe from the Umayyads and lived a quiet, luxurious life in Medina.
And the dossier points out that he actually offered alternatives to avoid a massacre, right? The narrative is often framed as Hussein eagerly rushing toward martyrdom, but he wasn't just seeking death.
No, he was a pragmatist seeking a principled way out. Al-Tabari records that even on the morning of Ashura, the day of the massacre, Hussein offered 3 options to the Umayyad commanders.
What were they?
He said, "Let me return to Medina where I came from, let me go to a distant frontier post to fight external enemies, or let me go directly to Yazid in Damascus to negotiate face-to-face." He actively sought to avoid shedding Muslim blood.
So he was trying to de-escalate.
Absolutely. But the Umayyad governor, Ibn Ziyad, rejected all diplomatic off-ramps. He demanded absolute, unconditional surrender. He wanted Hussein to submit to his authority, to be paraded in Kufa in chains.
Wow, he wasn't refusing peace, he was refusing a piece of chains. He was refusing the total humiliation of the office he represented.
Precisely. Modern scholars, like Dr. Wilfred Madelung, point out that Hussein was motivated by deep, unshakable, pious conviction. It was a principled, total refusal of dynastic, corrupt rule. Hussein knew that capitulating to such ruthless, un-Islamic power would permanently degrade the moral conscience of the community. It would set a precedent that whoever wields the biggest sword is automatically the legitimate religious authority.
Okay, that makes complete sense of the political calculus.
Yeah.
But here is where the dossier gets incredibly heavy, and honestly a lot more difficult for a modern audience to digest. If Hussein knew the situation was deteriorating, if he was surrounded in the Iraqi desert and knew Ibn Ziyad was demanding total humiliation or death, why bring his family?
This is perhaps one of the most taboo, hotly debated critiques in the entire dossier.
Right. I'm going to lean into the atheist and secular critiques here because it's a glaring question. Isn't bringing women and children, including his own sister, his wives, and his 6-month-old infant son, Ali al-Asghar, to a literal war zone completely irresponsible?
I hear that a lot.
Some of the harsher critics in the dossier even accuse him of using his own family as emotional leverage, or worse, human shields, to garner political sympathy. How do scholars realistically defend that tactical decision?
It is a profoundly heavy question, but to answer it fairly, we have to entirely strip away our 21st century perspective on warfare and understand the brutal realities of the 7th century Umayyad state. First, we have to look at the threat matrix in Medina and Mecca.
Okay.
If Hussein had marched out with only his soldiers and left his women and children behind, they would not have been safe sitting at home. The Umayyad regime, particularly under governors like Ibn Ziyad, had a well-documented history of taking the families of political dissidents as hostages.
So they would just kidnap the family?
Yes, they would imprison women and children to force the men to surrender. Leaving them behind would have been handing the Umayyads the ultimate leverage.
So there was no concept of a safe haven back home. The state didn't respect the sanctity of the household if you were a political enemy.
None whatsoever. Furthermore, we have to look at the cultural and tribal code of 7th century Arabia. Traveling with your family and your dependents signaled unequivocally peaceful intentions.
Oh, because a raiding party doesn't bring kids.
Exactly. A war party, an army looking to launch an offensive, unprovoked attack, does not travel with its women, its elderly, and its infants. By bringing his entire household, Hussein was communicating clearly to the broader Islamic empire. I am not launching a violent insurrection, I am migrating.
But once they are at Karbala and the massive Umayyad army surrounds them, the presence of the family completely changes the entire dynamic of the standoff.
It does, and this brings us to a brilliant analytical concept articulated by modern scholars like Dr. Tahera Quatbadin, the idea of narrative resistance. Think about the sheer power of the Umayyad propaganda machine.
They controlled the narrative.
They controlled the state treasury, they controlled the pulpits in every major mosque across the empire, and they paid poets to sing their praises. If Hussein and his 72 men had died alone fighting in the remote desert, Yazid's spin doctors would have had a field day.
They just label them rebels.
Exactly. They would have simply labeled Hussein a Khariji, a state rebel, a bandit who tried to disrupt the peace of the empire and was swiftly, legally dealt with. The entire true story would have been buried under the sands of Karbala forever.
Because dead men tell no tales. The state writes the history books.
Exactly. But the women, particularly Hussein's formidable sister, Lady Zainab, survived the massacre. They were taken captive, their tents were burned, and they were marched in chains to Kufa and then all the way to Yazid's court in Damascus.
And that's where things change.
Radically. It was there, in the very heart of the tyrant's palace, that Lady Zainab delivered some of the most powerful, eloquent, and devastating speeches in the history of the Arabic language. She effectively became the media wing of the revolution. She exposed the reality of the massacre, she detailed the sheer un-Islamic brutality of the soldiers, and she publicly shamed the Umayyad elite in their own capital. Without the family being present, Karbala is just a tragic, localized skirmish. With the family surviving to tell the tale, it becomes a civilizational turning point. The women ensured the truth survived the slaughter.
That reframes it entirely. They weren't just passive collateral damage, they were active, essential participants in preserving the legacy. It was a joint mission. But we still have to talk about the infant, Ali al-Asghar.
Yes.
The dossier details his death, and frankly, it is just harrowing to read. How do scholars historically contextualize that level of brutality against a 6-month-old baby?
The tragedy of Ali al-Asghar is universally condemned across all Islamic traditions, Sunni and Shia alike, and it serves as a critical historical pivot point. The historical accounts record that the Umayyad army had completely cut off Hussein's camp from the Euphrates River for days.
In the desert heat.
It was the scorching heat of Iraq, and the camp was slowly dying of thirst. The accounts say that Hussein brought the dying infant forward, not to fight, not to use him as a shield, but to appeal to whatever tiny shred of humanity the opposing army might have left. He simply asked for water for the child, stating that even if they considered him a rebel, the infant had committed no crime.
And the dossier notes their response was an arrow.
Yes. A specialized, 3-pronged arrow shot by an Umayyad archer named Harmala, which struck the neck of the infant.
Subhanallah. That's just, I have no words.
It's horrific, but why is this horrifying detail so critical historically? Because it serves as the ultimate, undeniable proof that the Umayyad forces had abandoned all Islamic and even pre-Islamic Arab codes of chivalry and warfare.
You can't justify that.
No, you cannot spin the murder of a thirsty, dying infant as a military necessity or collateral damage. It stripped away any lingering veneer of religious legitimacy Yazid's army claimed to possess. It exposed the absolute, undeniable moral bankruptcy of the regime. The atheist critique looks at this and says, this shows the sheer barbarity of human nature. But the Islamic defense actually agrees with that assessment. It was human evil, unchecked by divine law, and it proved exactly why Hussein could not, under any circumstances, legitimize such a government.
It is devastating. Mashallah, the resilience of the survivors to carry that trauma forward is unfathomable. But this brings up a massive assumption we're making about the very nature of the universe, leading directly into the philosophical problem of theodicy. If Hussein was the beloved grandson of the Prophet, if he was unequivocally on the side of truth, justice, and divine law, why didn't God intervene? Why did the righteous suffer so brutally while the corrupt won the battle?
This is the classic problem of evil, sometimes called the Epicurean paradox, applied to a hyper-specific, deeply traumatic historical event. Ex-Muslims and atheists in the dossier point to Karbala and ask, where was God? If Islam promises divine support and protection to the righteous, doesn't the massacre and mutilation of the Prophet's own family objectively disprove that support?
Right. It challenges the whole concept of a just, observant universe. If the best people suffer the worst fate, what is the point of being good?
It does challenge that if, and this is a massive if, you measure justice strictly by worldly, immediate, material success, but the Islamic theological framework operates on an entirely different axis.
How so?
In Islamic theology, this world is explicitly defined as Dar al-Ibtila, a place of severe trial and testing. The Quran is entirely clear that being beloved by God does not grant you a magical force field against worldly suffering. In fact, classical scholars point out it is often the exact opposite.
The Prophet suffered the most.
Exactly. The Quran specifically mentions previous prophets who were brutally mocked, tortured, and killed by their own people, like Yahya, who is John the Baptist, and Zachariah. Worldly victory, having a palace, or winning a sword fight is not the metric of divine favor in Islam.
So suffering isn't a sign of divine abandonment. It's part of the architecture of the test.
Precisely. Classical scholars, both Sunni and Shia, view the extreme suffering of the righteous as an elevation of their spiritual rank in the hereafter, and simultaneously as a severe, undeniable indictment against the perpetrators. But there's another fascinating layer here in the dossier. The sources indicate that Hussein's martyrdom wasn't just a tragic, unforeseen accident of tribal politics, it was actively foretold.
Yes, the dossier mentions a specific tradition, the Hadith of Salama. Can you unpack the mechanics of that? Because claiming prophecy changes the whole dynamic.
Certainly. This isn't just an obscure Shia tradition. It is found in highly authenticated Sunni Hadith collections, like the Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Al-Hakim's Mustadrak. The tradition states that the Prophet Muhammad was visited by the angel Gabriel, who handed him a handful of red soil.
Red soil!
Yes, Gabriel informed the Prophet that this was the soil of a place called Karbala, and that his infant grandson, Hussein, would one day be slaughtered on it. The Prophet, weeping, gave this soil to his wife, Salama, for safekeeping, and told her that when this soil miraculously turned to blood, she would know that Hussein had been martyred.
Okay, but if there was foreknowledge, if the Prophet knew, and presumably Hussein knew his fate, why go through with it? Doesn't that negate free will? It makes the whole thing sound like a predetermined script where Hussein is just pulling a role, which kind of undercuts the bravery of his choice.
This is where we get into some of the most sophisticated theology in the dossier. It brings in the complex concept of Bada, particularly in Shia thought, though the broader concept of how divine foreknowledge interacts with free will exists in Sunni theology as well.
Okay, so what is Badam?
Bada does not mean that God changes his mind or suddenly learns something new. It refers to the progressive revelation of the divine will to humanity.
So how does that preserve Hussein's free will?
Think of it like a grandmaster playing chess.
Okay.
The grandmaster knows all possible permutations of the board. He knows that if his opponent makes a specific, aggressive move, it will lead to the opponent's ultimate defeat. The opponent still freely chooses to make that move out of greed or aggression. God's foreknowledge of what Yazid and Ibn Ziyad would freely choose to do in their lust for power does not force them to do it.
Ah, I see.
Hussein freely chose to march out of a moral obligation to resist tyranny, and the Umayyads freely chose to slaughter him to maintain power. The prophetic foreknowledge simply establishes the massive cosmic and spiritual significance of the event. It wasn't a failure of divine protection. It was the unfolding of a necessary, paradigm-shifting sacrifice.
A necessary sacrifice. Explain that. Because losing your entire family in the desert doesn't look like a victory from any conventional angle.
Well, look at the historical aftermath. Militarily, tactically, on the afternoon of the 10th of Muharram, Hussein lost. He was beheaded, his camp was looted, and his family was in chains. But historians and theologians frame this as a profound meta-historical victory.
How so?
By forcing the Umayyads to show their true, incredibly brutal face, Hussein destroyed their religious legitimacy forever. They could no longer claim to be the pious successors of the Prophet while parading the head of the Prophet's grandson on a spear.
The optics are just terrible.
Exactly. And the Umayyad dynasty, despite its massive wealth and military might, completely collapsed within 70 years of Karbala, which is a mere blink of an eye historically, largely because the memory of Karbala haunted them. Constant rebellions erupted in the name of avenging Hussein. So Hussein won morally and eschatologically. His stand became a permanent, timeless condemnation of tyranny.
It is profound when you think about it. It completely challenges our modern hyper-capitalist obsession with immediate success. The idea that if you do the right thing, you will automatically win the battle today and get a promotion.
Yeah, we want instant gratification.
It suggests that sometimes true victory takes generations to unfold.
Uh-huh.
The victory isn't merely surviving the day. The victory is the ethical legacy you leave behind.
Exactly. But all of these profound theological and moral conclusions about his sacrifice rely on one massive foundational assumption that the story actually happened the way we think it did.
Right, which brings us to the historiography section of the dossier. How do we actually know any of this? We are talking about an event that occurred in the remote Iraqi desert in the year 680 CE. In ancient history, that usually means there's a 200-year gap before anyone writes a single word down.
Usually, yes.
Are the dramatic details of Karbala, the specific speeches, the denial of water, the individual duels just a 1400-year-old game of telephone? How much of this is historically verified fact, and how much is just later theatrical embellishment or sectarian myth-making?
It is the most critical question a historian can ask. When dealing with ancient history, there is always a severe risk of mythologization. But here's where the academic consensus in the dossier might surprise people. The core events of Karbala are incredibly well attested across independent, surprisingly early sources. We are not relying on a single, biased text written centuries later by a sectarian zealot.
Look, as someone reading these secular critiques, my immediate red flag is the methodology. Who are these primary sources, and why should a modern secular historian trust them?
The foundational historical text for Karbala comes from an early Kufan historian named Abu Miknaf. He died in 774 CE, which is less than a century after the event.
A century? That's still a long time.
A century might sound like a long time to us, but in the context of oral history cultures, it is virtually yesterday. Abu Miknaf's methodology was meticulous. He sought out and interviewed actual eyewitnesses, survivors of the battle, and descendants of the soldiers on both sides. He recorded their accounts using an isnad, a chain of transmission.
So he would document, I heard from this person, who heard from this person, who was standing on the right flank of the army.
Exactly. It is a highly structured method of preserving data. Abu Miknaf's monumental work was later preserved and embedded into the massive, authoritative Sunni chronicle of Al-Tabari in the 9th century. We also have corroborating accounts from other early historians, like al-Balaturi.
So it's cross-reference.
Very much so. When modern Western secular historians like Dr. Wilfred Madelung or Hugh Kennedy rigorously analyze these texts, applying modern source-critical methods, their consensus is clear. The historical skeleton Hussein's refusal to pledge allegiance to Yazid, the march to Kufa, the sudden encirclement by Ibn Ziyad's army, the multi-day water blockade, the massacre of the 72 men, and the taking of the women as captives, that is solid, undeniable history.
Okay, so the historical skeleton is solid. But the dossier also talks about the evolution of the narrative over the centuries. What about the later editions? Because as you read later texts, the story gets much more elaborate.
As centuries passed, especially moving into the 10th century, the Buyid period, and the Safavid era, we see the rise of Makhal literature-specialized martyrology texts. These texts began adding heavy layers of deep theological commentary, highly stylized poetic dialogue, and detailed accounts of miracles.
Right.
They were designed not strictly for historical documentation, but for communal mourning, emotional resonance, and identity building.
That brings up the miracles, the karamat. The dossier mentions incredible supernatural claims like the severed head of Hussein reciting verses of the Quran while being paraded on a spear in Damascus, or the earth physically weeping blood on the day of his death. How do modern historians even begin to process these supernatural claims compared to theologians?
This is where methodology wildly diverges based on who is reading the text. Classical Islamic scholars, both Sunni and Shia, operate in a worldview that generally accepts the possibility of karamat miracles granted by God to saints and profoundly holy figures.
So they take it as literal truth.
Yes, they view these supernatural events as literal signs of Hussein's immense spiritual sanctity and God's cosmic anger at the crime. However, modern secular historians, restricted by empirical methodology, treat these elements as sacred biography. They analyze them not as biological or geological facts, but as vital literary and cultural motifs that helped a traumatized community process the sheer unthinkable horror of what happened to the Prophet's family.
The thing is, even if you strip away every single supernatural element, every poetic flourish, every stylized speech from those later texts, the historical skeleton of the massacre remains completely undeniable. It's almost like the historical truth is devastating enough on its own, it doesn't need the supernatural to be a profound tragedy.
That is a very fair secular assessment. But we must understand that for the believers, those supernatural elements are not mere fictional decorations. They are expressions of the cosmic weight of the event. And this differing approach to interpreting the history leads directly into the deep fault lines of our next topic.
The theology.
Right. The history is verified, but the meaning of that history created theological schisms that still shape the Middle East today.
Right. Let's dig into these theological divides.
Yeah.
Because looking at the critiques in the dossier, there is a lot of internal friction between different Islamic sects regarding Karbala. For instance, the most common critique from conservative Sunni or Salafi voices is about the intense veneration of Hussein in Shia Islam. They ask, does this constant crying, shrine building, and calling out to Hussein verge on shirk polytheism? Or is that practice totally misunderstood by its critics?
This is the absolute core of the theological debate within Islam regarding Karbala. The charge of shirk usually stems from conflating three distinct theological concepts: tawassul, which is intercession; tazim, which is veneration; and ibadah, which is worship.
Okay, break those down.
Mainstream Shia theology, articulated by intellectual giants like Sheikh al-Mufid in the classical era or Allama Tabatabai in the modern era, is strictly, unyieldingly monotheistic. They explicitly state that ibadah worship is for God and God alone. Anyone who worships Hussein as a deity is entirely outside the fold of Islam.
So when millions of people gather at his shrine in Karbala and cry out, Ya Hussein, what is the mechanical theological defense? How is that not praying to him?
The defense is the concept of tawassul. It is not praying to Hussein as an independent divine power source. It is asking for his spiritual advocacy before God by God's permission.
So mechanically speaking, it's not viewing Hussein as the battery generating the power, but rather as a highly conductive, perfectly pure wire connected to the original power source, God.
That is a brilliant analogy, yes. It is acknowledging his extreme proximity to the divine due to his purity and his sacrifice. Believers are saying, oh God, by the right and the status of this man who sacrificed everything for you, grant my prayer.
That makes sense.
And what is crucial to understand from a historical perspective is that classical Sunni theology, featuring scholars like al-Mawawi and Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, they also historically permitted the veneration of the pious dead and seeking blessings through them.
Wait, really? So the stark Sunni-Shia divide on visiting shrines isn't as historically deep as we are led to believe?
Not historically, no. For centuries, the vast majority of Sunni Muslims also revered Hussein deeply, visited shrines, and mourned his passing. The severe absolute critique of visiting shrines and seeking intercession primarily originates much later.
When was that?
It is heavily influenced by the 18th century Wahhabi movement in the Arabian Peninsula and modern Salafi interpretations, which view building over graves and seeking intercession as forbidden innovations leading to polytheism. But that is a relatively modern paradigm shift in the broader scope of Islamic history.
Let's talk about the psychological mechanism of the mourning itself. The dossier mentions an Orientalist claim that compares Karbala to an Islamic passion play and directly asks if the idea of Hussein's blood redeeming the sins of the mourners is just copied wholesale from Christianity.
It is a compelling comparative religion question, but the underlying theology is fundamentally different. In Orthodox Christian theology, Jesus' death on the cross is a substitutionary atonement. He physically pays the price for humanity's original sin.
Right, taking the punishment for everyone else.
Exactly. Mainstream Shia theology entirely rejects substitutionary atonement. Hussein's suffering doesn't automatically act as a magic eraser for your sins just because you believe it happened.
So what is the purpose of the suffering theologically if it doesn't instantly save you?
It acts as a moral and emotional catalyst. Modern scholars like Mahmoud Ayub and Murtada Mutahari explain that believers connect to Hussein's sacrifice through intense empathetic mourning, and that emotional connection is supposed to transform their own daily ethics.
So the grief has a function.
Exactly. The tears shed for Hussein are meant to wash away the spiritual apathy and complacency of the believer, compelling them to live a life of justice, charity, and piety. You don't get a free pass into heaven, you get a profound moral awakening that demands action.
Okay, let's unpack one more major theological divide mentioned in the dossier, the concept of infallibility, or isma. Did the tragedy of Karbala invent the Shia idea that the imams are infallible?
It didn't invent the concept, but the events of Karbala absolutely solidified the necessity of the doctrine in Shia thought. Shia theologians point to Quranic verses, like the verse of purification or Ayat al-Tathir, arguing that if an imam is to guide humanity perfectly without leading them astray, he must be divinely protected from sin and error.
And Karbala proves that for them.
Yes, Hussein's absolute unwavering perfection of character at Karbala, his refusal to compromise ethics even when facing the slaughter of his own family, became the ultimate historical proof of his isma.
And the Sunni view.
Mainstream Sunnis, on the other hand, view the Al-Bayt, the Prophet's family, as highly revered, extraordinarily righteous, but ultimately fallible human beings. They deeply respect Hussein's moral stance, but don't attribute divine infallibility to him.
So the exact same historical event acts as a mirror, reflecting different theological necessities for each group. And honestly, if you're listening to this and wondering why a 7th century theological debate over infallibility or intercession matters to you today, consider how these deeply ingrained beliefs establish the blueprint for modern political action, because Karbala is very much a living, breathing concept today.
Absolutely. The memory of Karbala is perhaps more politically, socially, and militarily potent today than ever before, but this immense vitality brings intense modern controversy.
Let's tackle the most visual, often jarring controversy first. When people watch news footage of Ashura commemorations, they sometimes see practices like takbir self-flagellation with chains or blades, drawing blood. The secular critiques in the dossier are harsh on this. Doesn't this annual bloody mourning hold communities back? Does it portray Islam as barbaric to the outside world?
This is a highly debated, incredibly sensitive issue even within the deepest circles of the Shia community. It is crucial for outsiders to note that the absolute top Shia jurisprudential authorities today, Grand Ayatollahs like Ali al-Sistani in Iraq and Ali Khamenei in Iran, who have tens of millions of followers, they actively discourage or outright ban extreme physical practices like takbir.
Wait, really? They actually issue religious rulings banning it?
Yes, they issue fatwas against it. They argue several points. First, that it has no basis whatsoever in the Quran or the early traditions of the imams. Second, it causes unnecessary physical harm to the body, which is fundamentally forbidden in Islamic law.
That makes sense.
And third, practically speaking, it deeply damages the image of Islam globally. True mourning, according to mainstream Orthodox scholarship, is meant for moral, spiritual, and social renewal, not self-mutilation. The vast, vast majority of Shia Muslims globally commemorate Ashura through reciting poetry, hosting massive community meals, donating blood to hospitals, and participating in peaceful processions, not wielding blades.
That is a massive distinction that completely gets lost in sensationalist media coverage. But what about the political instrumentalization of Hussein's name? Hasn't the narrative of Karbala been constantly used to justify modern wars, insurgencies, and revolutions?
Constantly. Because Karbala is the ultimate, universally recognized narrative of resisting tyranny, anyone fighting a perceived oppressor desperately tries to claim Hussein's mantle. In the 20th century, it was used extensively and highly effectively during the 1979 Iranian Revolution to mobilize the masses against the Shah.
Yeah, framing the Shah as Yazid.
Exactly. The slogan, "Every day is Ashura, every land is Karbala," became a revolutionary rallying cry, framing the Shah as a modern-day Yazid.
But the dossier notes it is not just a Shia or even an Iranian phenomenon, right?
Not at all. It transcends sect entirely. It has been used for anti-colonial agitation in Pakistan and India against the British Empire. Interestingly, during the Egyptian Arab Spring in 2011, a prominent Sunni scholar from Al-Azhar, Sheikh Imad Afat, who was tragically killed in the protests in Cairo, explicitly used the Husseini approach to oppose the authoritarianism of the Mubarak regime.
Oh, wow.
He saw Hussein as a universal blueprint for nonviolent civil resistance against an entrenched state military.
The dossier even mentions non-Muslims drawing from this well. Mahatma Gandhi.
Yes, Gandhi famously stated that he learned from Hussein how to achieve victory while being oppressed. He drew direct inspiration from Hussein's principled stand against a vastly superior military force, realizing that moral authority can eventually topple physical empire. It transcends sectarian and religious lines as a universal humanist appeal for human dignity and resistance.
But there is a very dark side to this instrumentalization. What about extremist militant groups today? We see rhetoric from terrorist organizations that try to use early Islamic battles to justify horrific violence and the establishment of new caliphates.
This is where we must be incredibly precise, because the theology and the history matter. The rhetoric of extremist groups like ISIS actually inverts the entire legacy of Karbala.
How so? Walk me through the mechanics of that inversion.
Look at Hussein's actual documented actions in the dossier. He explicitly refused to initiate violence. He offered negotiation and diplomacy until the very last morning.
Yes.
He sought to protect civilians, women, and dependents at all costs. He was entirely on the defensive against state terror.
Right.
Modern extremism, however, relies entirely on offensive violence, intentionally targeting civilians, and ruling through the exact kind of fear, coercion, and terror that Yazid's governor, Ibn Ziyad, used in Kufa.
Alhamdulillah, it seems the mainstream scholars across all sects boldly call this hypocrisy out. They use Hussein's actual, historically documented legacy of restraint, justice, and self-sacrifice to condemn that exact kind of modern tyranny. You simply cannot claim to follow the path of Hussein while acting out the playbook of Yazid.
Exactly. And that ethical clarity, that ability to hold up a mirror to power, is why the meticulous study of Karbala remains so vital 1,400 years later. It forces a community and humanity at large to constantly audit its own moral compass.
We have covered incredible dense ground today, from the intricate intelligence failures and socioeconomic tribal politics of 7th century Kufa to complex, heavy theological debates about intercession, theodicy, and infallibility, right up to the Arab Spring and modern geopolitics. It is a massive amount of historical trauma and philosophy to process.
It is, but if we are to distill all of this, all 100 questions in the dossier, all the classical theological defenses and the sharp modern secular critiques down to a single enduring truth, it is this. Imam Hussein has become the ultimate metric of legitimacy.
The metric of legitimacy. I like that phrasing. What does that mean in practical modern terms?
It means that today, any government, whether it claims to be Islamic, secular, or otherwise, that demands submission through fear, that rules through corruption, economic strangulation, and the sword, is permanently haunted by the shadow of Karbala.
Because the contrast is right there.
Yes. Hussein proved with his own life and the lives of his family that death with dignity is better than a life of humiliation. He permanently severed the ancient idea that military might equals moral right. By dying on those sands, he made his memory a permanent, lingering threat to authoritarianism anywhere in the world. As long as people remember the mechanics of Karbala, tyrants can never sleep soundly.
It takes us right back to where we started, standing in the quiet, foundational streets of Medina, visualizing the childhood of the Prophet's grandson. You look at that history, at the sheer weight of the dossier we've explored, and suddenly the timeline doesn't feel linear anymore. The agonizing choices made on those burning sands aren't just ancient artifacts stored in a museum. They are a living, breathing framework, holding up the moral architecture of millions of people today. May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.